Anirban Basu is the founder of Sage Policy Group Incorporated, a powerhouse economic and policy consultancy. Renowned as the chief economist for prestigious organizations like the Maryland Bankers Association, he's been hailed as one of Baltimore's most influential business leaders. With 4 graduate degrees, including a JD and PhD, Dr. Basu's experience is unmatched. In his keynote address, Dr. Basu will delve into crucial economic drivers, ranging from central bank policies to geopolitics. He will present forecasts for the year ahead, revealing the opportunities and challenges awaiting economic stakeholders. Please welcome Anirban Basu.
That was very impressive, I have to say. Yeah. So my name is Anirban Basu. I'm an economist. Please hold any further applause. And I've been asked to talk to you about the economy, where we are in the business cycle, what that might mean, of course, for capital spending and other aspects of economic life. If we could put my presentation on all the screens here, just so everyone can see. The presentation today is entitled, Show Me the Money Supply. This is a Tom Cruise theme presentation. You'll see that theming throughout the presentation, whether you'd like it or not. This is him from the 1996 hit film Jerry Maguire, in which he plays the role of a sports agent with a single client, the fictitious Arizona Cardinals wide receiver Rod Tidwell, played by the actor Cuba Gooding Jr. In any case, you'll see plentiful Tom Cruise references as I go through the presentation, whether you like it or not. But I hope you don't hate it, but we shall see. But this is not so much about Tom Cruise. This is about the economy and where we are in the economic cycle. And of course, the subject of the economy is vast. And so an economist could begin almost anywhere. So why begin with introducing the concept of money supply? Well, as it turns out, that's at the heart of the matter. That when money supply is expanding, the cost of capital is low, let's say in the form of low interest rates, and money is readily accessible, including through the banking system, all things being equal, that's good for economic growth, and that's good for project financing, for instance, including for major capital projects. However, when money supply is shrinking, when the cost of capital is rising, when money is becoming more difficult to access, that's all things being equal, bad for economic growth and bad for project financing and all kinds of things economic. Now, much of the data I will show you this afternoon are time series data, so the more contemporary data are to the right of the slide. This is money supply graph back to 1959. If you look to the right of the slide, you can see how profound the growth in money supply had been during much of the pandemic recovery period. This is engineered largely by 2 organizations, the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, which is, of course, expanding its balance sheet, at least until recently, driving interest rates as close to zero as is possible to try to get us to borrow more and spend more, borrow more and invest more to countervail the worst effects of the pandemic on the economy. And of course, the US federal government is borrowing money aggressively and spending that money in the economy either directly or indirectly. These are acts of money supply creation. And from the perspective of fomenting recovery from the worst periods of the pandemic, it absolutely works. By the second quarter of 2021, US gross domestic product is above its pre-pandemic level. So the pandemic undoes the economy during the spring of 2020. A bit more than a year later, we are back, at least along that dimension. Unfortunately, that V-shaped, very rapid recovery brings with it a period of enduring inflation or excess inflation. The Federal Reserve has been working for the last year plus to countervail those excess inflationary forces, raising interest rates, shrinking the size of their balance sheets. And that, of course, has led to a decline in money supply. And money's become more expensive. And one could also argue more difficult to access from a project financing or financing generally perspective. And so when money's become more expensive and more difficult to access, when money supply is shrinking, that can produce some pretty risky business. And that's what we want to talk about today, the risks in the economy. So, and what is the culprit here? Why have we shifted the narrative from talking about very rapid economic rebound from the worst period of the pandemic to not talk about at least the risk of recession, at least over the next 12 months? Why? Well, of course, the culprit here is inflation, and in particular, the Federal Reserve's response to those excess inflationary forces. This is the U.S. Consumer Price Index. This is 12-month percentage change, 2 lines here. The line in green is your overall consumer price index. Now, back in June of 2022, consumer inflation is running at 9% year over year. For the last month for which we have data, which is June of 2023, that number turned out to be 3%. So we've made a lot of progress in terms of combating excess inflation, 9% to 3%. Though I must say, much of the decline in inflation is attributable to food and energy prices. So we can focus on oil prices, for instance, which after the Russians launched their invasion of Ukraine was around $120 a barrel plus for a brief period. Today, around $81 a barrel in North America. Egg prices are another source of focus, or have been for many Americans. I don't know how many of you have become embroiled in conversations about egg prices so far this year, often with neighbors. Very difficult to extract yourself once these conversations begin, as it turns out. Indeed, earlier this year, I delivered a presentation at the University of Delaware. The University of Delaware, as you know, gave us the greatest quarterback in NFL history, Joe Flacco. But also their team name is the Blue Hens. Their mascot is the Blue Hens. And I looked those Blue Hens right in the face and I said, you Blue Hens should be raising chickens, because at that time, of course, egg prices were high. They also did not laugh at that. But the point is that egg prices have come down along with other food prices in many cases. In fact, recently egg prices were down 77% since their 2022 peak. Now you strip out food and energy prices, you'll get the other line here, this kind of bronze-colored line. That's your so-called core rate inflation, all items less food and energy. And that looks stickier, generating 4.8% inflation over the past year through June of 2023. Either measure, of course, continues to be above the Federal Reserve's 2% inflation target. So the inflation fight is not yet won. Nonetheless, lots of progress has been made. Now, that said, prices are still rising, albeit at a slower pace. And the effect of this is cumulative as it relates, for instance, to household budgets or balance sheets. The consumer has been absolutely waylaid by higher prices. So this is the U.S. Consumer Price Index, May of 2020. Why that month? That's the first month of the economic recovery from the early stages of the pandemic. So America loses those 22 million jobs in March and April of 2020. We start to come back in May of 2020 in terms of recovering some of those jobs. So if you look at price levels in May of 2020 and benchmark that against June of 2023, last month for which you have data, you can see the headline numbers here. Overall inflation running at 19% in a bit more than 3 years. In a country that aspires to 2% inflation per annum. Strip out food and energy prices, inflation is around 16%, but still significant. You look at the green colored bars, you can see categorically what's been going on. Energy prices up 55%. Used car and truck prices up 46%. Transportation services, that includes things like your airfares, up 33%. Tobacco and smoking product prices up 23%. New vehicle product prices up 22%. So one of the worst things you can do is smoke in a new car, as that destroys the new car smell. It's pretty bad for your health, but also renders one susceptible to much of this inflation. Now, it is true that inflation has dissipated over the past year. So if you just look at June of 2022 versus June of 2023, again, you can see the headline numbers down before, 3% overall inflation, 4.8% on the core. But you still see some stubbornly high inflation in some of these categories. So transportation services up 8%, shelter prices up 8%, food prices up nearly 6%. And who is most affected by these rising food and shelter prices? Well, of course, people in the lowest quintiles of income. People for whom food and shelter comprises a disproportionate share of their household budgets. It's one of the reasons the Federal Reserve is so keen on bringing down inflation, because they know that there are a lot of vulnerable families out there. For instance, about 13% of the Americans who are aged 80 or above live in poverty, as an example. And they're just absolutely hammered because their fixed incomes can't handle it. So how does the Federal Reserve deal with this? Well, they turn to their leading policy instrument, which is the Fed funds rate. Here I'm graphing through the upper limit on the Fed funds rate. So the minimum possible interest rate here is 0.25%. Coming into the pandemic, this rate is non-zero. This is not set by the free market, this interest rate. This is a policy instrument of the Federal Reserve established at the Federal Open Market Committee meetings. So as the pandemic sweeps through the economy, this interest rate goes as close to zero as is possible. Very rapid recovery again. By the spring of 2021, we start to see excess inflation really bubble up. The Federal Reserve responds by doing precisely nothing about it. They deem inflation to be transitory. You've heard this word many times before. A synonym for transitory is fleeting. So they view this as simply supply chain driven. The notion was that as the economy reopened in fits and starts, demand was growing profoundly. Supply chains had been shuttered to varying degrees. Supply was not rising up to meet demand. That's inflationary. too much demand chasing too few goods and services. But as supply chains normalized, as they healed, supply would rise up to meet demand, and inflation would go back to that 2% target. And that's what inflation had been for many, many years, 2%. Instead, what the Federal Reserve appears to have done is to preside over the creation of a wage price spiral. So prices take off during the spring of 2021. Employees look at the CPI data and say, are you looking at this, boss? Do you see how much inflation is out there? I look at the CPI data all the time, boss. Now, they never had before, but all of a sudden they were. Because inflation had been 2%, why even look? But now it wasn't 2% anymore, it was 9%. I need a raise. Boss says, no problem. I'll give you a raise. Economy is coming back very, very quickly. There's lots of unmet demand out there. I need you. Moreover, I can just pass along my cost increases to my customers, which one can do in an inflationary environment. It can hide more margin. In fact, corporate profits are positively correlated with inflation. Well, that, of course, creates another burst of inflation, which leads to more wage price increases or wage spikes. And so now you're in the midst of a wage price spiral. Now, starting in March of 2022, March 16th of 2022, the Federal Reserve starts raising interest rates. But even then, they only dip their toes in the inflation-fighting waters, raising interest rates by 0.25%. Next meeting, 0.5%, then 4 consecutive meetings of 0.75%, then back to 0.5%, then 0.25%, then 0.25%. May 3rd of this year, 0.25%. They paused in June. July 26th, last week, 0.25%. So an interest rate that had been 0.25%, again, the upper limit on the Fed funds rate, is now 5.5%. Now, what are they trying to do with the Federal Reserve? They're not trying to destroy the economy, ostensibly. They're trying to engineer a soft landing. They want to frustrate demand growth by raising the cost of interest, leading us to borrow less and spend less, borrow less and invest less, to try to reduce demand and bring demand into conformity with supply, thereby ridding the economy of excess demand and excess inflation. They want to do all of that without driving us into recession. And the question becomes, is that possible to do that, to engineer that soft landing, or is it mission impossible? That becomes the question, really. And here's the amazing thing about it. The economy right now, despite all these interest rate increases and war raging in Eastern Europe, is not in recession, not even close. In fact, by some indications, the economy is actually gaining in terms of momentum, even as the Federal Reserve has continued to raise interest rates. The broadest indication of U.S. economic progress is gross domestic product, quarterly data, annualized rates of growth. You can see, if you look toward the left of the slide, the undoing of the U.S. economy during the first half of 2020, including that negative 29.9% performance during the second quarter of 2020, but then the V-shaped recovery, the 35.3% during the third quarter. Several ensuing quarters of high single-digit rates of growth in an economy accustomed to growing 2% per annum, roughly, 1.5% to 3% per annum, let's say. True, during the first half of 2022, America sustains 2 consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth, satisfying a technical definition of recession. The economy grew in nominal terms, but once adjusted for inflation, real growth turned negative. But then the bounce back during the third quarter of last year, 3.2%, 2.6% to finish off 2022. First quarter of the year, the U.S. economy grows 2%. We just got second quarter GDP data in for the Bureau of Economic Analysis, 2.4%. The Atlanta Federal Reserve maintains a product known as GDP Now, which estimates current quarter gross domestic product. We're now in the third quarter of 2023, and that estimate suggests that the U.S. economy is on pace to grow 3.9% on an annualized basis during the current quarter. None of these are indicia of recession. Indeed, there are certain parts of the economy that continue to be especially strong, and at the heart of that is the American consumer, who continues to spend quite aggressively. This is retail sales, monthly data. As you know, we're right in the midst of corporate earnings season. Broadly speaking, the S&P 500 is divided into 11 segments. Now, earnings have beat estimates so far this earnings season by 7%, but no category among those 11 has seen more earnings beats, proportionally speaking, than the consumer discretionary segment. So earnings are up 7% relative to expectations. In the consumer discretionary segment is 13%. Fourth is your consumer staples. In between is communications and industrials, but in terms of earnings beats. But you can see this is retail sales. And you can see how significant retail sales are relative to where we were pre-pandemic. So early in 2020, you can see the dip in retail sales activity, but then again, the V-shaped recovery. Now, If you look carefully at the data, you will see that on a monthly basis, there has been some retrenchment occasionally. So November and December of last year, retail sales slipped, happened again in February and March of this year. We'll come back to this. But generally speaking, the consumer has been quite aggressive in their spending. Part of the stagnation in retail sales growth is because consumers are spending more on services. And you can see this at airports, for instance. If you flew into San Antonio's airport, it was busy. TSA lines are going to be long when you fly out of that airport, if that's where you're flying out of. So that's where we are. Now, part of this spending is attributable to excess savings accumulated during the worst of the pandemic. So there was a point at which excess savings, meaning savings above and beyond what would have been saved but for the pandemic, totaled around $2.7 trillion. Consumers have spent down that excess savings to around $1 trillion, and much of that $1 trillion is in the hands of the highest quintile of income, people who already have lots of things, lots of money, consume lots of services, so on and so forth, that have a lower marginal propensity to spend. Nonetheless, many other Americans continue to put money on their credit cards, continue to fuel spending, and they're supported, among other things, by a very strong labor market. This is monthly job growth. The last time America lost jobs was in December of 2020, which was a COVID-intensive pre-vaccination month. The last reading here is June of 2023, a month during which America adds 209,000 jobs. Now, at the end of this presentation, I'll give you my forecast for the economy. This is not about you buying into my forecast, by the way. I'm agnostic with respect to that. My goal today is to do some issue spotting on your behalf so you can refine your own projections of the economy and what that means for your enterprise, your other stakeholders. But I got to tell you, the economy has not worked out the way I would have anticipated in many ways. And I'll give you an example. If somebody had said to me in February of 2022, February of last year, Anirban, here's what's going to happen. The Russians are going to make their move on the Ukrainians. That is, in fact, going to happen. It'll begin on February 24th. Oil prices will skyrocket. So will natural gas, fertilizer prices, wheat. And then the next month, the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States will start raising interest rates at the fastest pace in more than 4 decades. Anirban, what do you think is going to happen with unemployment? Now, back in March of 2022, U.S. unemployment is sitting at 3.6%. I'm skeptical that I would have answered that question by saying, I think unemployment will remain at 3.6%. That's exactly what's happened. Again, the last reading that we have here is 209,000 jobs added. True, that was the weakest performance since December of 2020 on a monthly basis. Nonetheless, there are various leading indicators out there that suggest that there's still an appetite for more hiring. Indeed, this morning we received data from the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, which indicated that as of June, America home to 9.6 million available unfilled jobs. This country is associated with 1.6 job openings for every unemployed American. Number of unemployed Americans is almost precisely 6 million. Yes, it is true the number of job openings has been falling recently. That's true. But if you compare this to pre-pandemic, when the economy was very, very strong, and we were in the midst of the lengthiest economic expansion in American history, we had about 7 million job openings back then, pre-pandemic. Now 9.6 million. And that's inflationary. And that's one of the reasons I think that the Federal Reserve's war on inflation is not yet won. It looks pretty good if you do the extrapolation in terms of where inflation is headed. But I think there's some stubbornness there that's coming from the labor market. And this is not simply a cyclical issue. It's not simply a function of how quickly the U.S. economy rebounded from the worst of the pandemic economically. There's a structural issue here. The size of the U.S. labor force, so you're part of the labor force, if you're either working or looking for work, the size of the U.S. labor force is not growing rapidly enough to accommodate the needs, wants, desires, aspirations of economic actors, including consumers in this country. So you can look at the demographics of the country, for instance. Here I'm graphing through the labor force participation rate, or charting for you the labor force participation rate comparing 1980, when music was good, versus 2023. So 1980, when Billy Squier was still performing, versus 2023, as was Prince and Michael Jackson, so on and so forth, Styx. So 1980 versus 2023. So again, to be part of the labor force, you have to be either working or looking for work. So I'm taking a delta here of proportions. There's a labor force participation rate in 1980, there was a labor force participation rate, or is in 2023, I'm taking the percentage difference. So if you look at the top row here, which is also the bolded row, between 1980 and 2023, the U.S. labor force participation rate fell 1.2 percentage points, falling 9.4 percentage points among men, but rising 5.7 percentage points among women. So women jumped into the labor force, men jumped out. I can break this down by age. So 16 and 19-year-olds. So in the US, you have to be at least 16 to be part of the labor force. In Canada, it's 15. Here, it's 16. But if you look at 16 and 19-year-olds, negative 19.6 percentage points overall, negative 24 percentage points among men, negative 16 percentage points among women. What's that about? That's college. So college enrollment skyrockets during this period. We lost a ton of manufacturing jobs in this country in the 1970s. The mantra among many families became this is going to become an increasingly service sector-oriented economy, and to participate at the commanding heights of that economy, one has to be quite gainfully educated. To become an engineer, a physician, an attorney, an auditor, an actuary, whatever it happens to be. And so if somebody is in college, one is less likely to offer their services to the US labor market. 20 to 24-year-olds, negative 5.7 percentage points overall, negative 13 percentage points among men, but positive 1.1 percentage points among women. What's that about? Well, it can still be college. So it probably takes most guys 6 to 8 years to finish college. But then you look at 25 to 34-year-olds, positive 3.6 percentage points overall, negative 6.1 percentage points among men, positive 12.5 percentage points among women. What are these young men doing precisely? They are 25 to 34 years of age. They're neither working nor looking for work, and they live in this country. What are they doing? No one really knows because everyone's too scared to ask. But my very strong sense it involves a couch in a parent's basement, bologna and salami sandwiches coming magically from above, maybe some video game play, maybe some weed. Now, I'm not judging. That's not my role here. And some of you might say, Anirban, CII invited you as an economist to be data-driven, to be analytical, to be dispassionate, unemotional. You're getting angry up there. And you might say to me, Anirban, the idea of a 33-year-old American man, sitting in his parents' basement, playing video games and smoking weed, that's adorable. I don't disagree. I think that's adorable too. But it's less adorable when they're 43. So you look at 35 to 44-year-olds, positive 3.8 percentage points overall, negative 5.3 percentage points among men, positive 11.9 percentage points among women. And for male-dominated segments of the economy, like construction, manufacturing, mining, energy exploration, this creates especially significant issues in terms of labor force formation. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Now, to again, get back to how hot the recovery has been and how hot it remains, despite the fact that American employers have hired so many people, and despite the fact that, in fact, that we've recovered all the jobs we lost during the pandemic, American employers want to hire more. So if you were to compare February of 2020 employment in this country, why that month? That's the last month we were shut down the economy, at least in parts, versus June of 2023, last month for which we have data, America's up 3.8 million jobs. Now, these green horizontal bars represent the number of jobs added or subtracted by each of these categories. So at the top of the list is professional and business services. That's your law firms, your accounting firms. Lots of white-collar jobs are allocated into those segments. It is a very large part of the US economy, which helps explain part of its primacy here, but also disproportionately, it offers the opportunity for people to work remotely. And that's what many Americans want. They want to work remotely. A recent survey from Good Hire indicates that 68% of Americans prefer working remotely as opposed to in an office, for instance. They don't want to commute. They don't want to be with their colleagues. They do not like their colleagues. A separate survey finds that 57% of Americans find their colleagues to be annoying because they overshare, meaning I asked you what you did this weekend. I did not intend for you to answer. They take credit for one another's work, but the number of reasons people find their colleagues to be annoying, they interrupt during meetings, which can happen on Zoom and typically does. Nonetheless, there's a general preference for remote work. At the bottom of the list, leisure and hospitality. That's your hotel and restaurant worker. It is the lowest wage segment of the economy, so often outcompeted for human capital along the dimension of compensation, but also as a practical matter, does not offer the opportunity for people to work remotely. Now, the segment of greatest interest today, construction, 339,000 jobs added. More than 350,000 available unfilled jobs in that segment of the economy, not quite a record high, actually a bit more than 370,000, given today's data. So lots of demand for construction workers, and construction has been hired. In fact, it's been toward the vanguard of hiring in this country, but we'll come back to that later on. So at the end of the day, we continue to have these labor market shortages, particularly in certain segments of the economy, like construction, manufacturing, for demographic and other reasons. And this issue is particularly significant in communities that have been growing faster economically. So this is economic growth for the 25 largest metropolitan areas in America. So percentage change between February of 20, the number of jobs supported by these communities in February of 2020, versus June of 2023, again, the last month for which we have data. Notice the primacy of the American South. That's where the population growth has been fastest. That's where the job growth has been fastest. Dallas, Charlotte, Tampa, San Antonio, Atlanta, Orlando, Houston, Riverside, California. Now, Philadelphia sneaks into that left-hand column, these faster-growing markets, Philadelphia, which burned down I-95 and then quickly rebuilt it. But for the most part, you can see the primacy of the American South. The Northeast corridor, for the most part, including my town of Baltimore, but Washington, Boston, New York is in the right-hand column, along with the Midwest, Chicago, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Detroit. That's where population growth has been slower, and therefore job growth has been slower. These things form an equilibrium. Now, I find this slide to be quite compelling, but the next slide is far more important macroeconomically. Same 25 major metropolitan areas, but instead of employment growth, these are unemployment rates as of May. And here's the issue. These unemployment rates are too low. I say, Anirban, that's crazy talk. We love low rates of unemployment. We love it when people graduate from an apprenticeship program or high school or college and can quickly secure opportunity. We like it when, let's say, a person loses a job through no fault of their own and can quickly find replacement employment. Yes, as a general proposition, we like low rates of unemployment. We view it as a sign of national economic strength, national economic vigor. But we like it less when there are 9.6 million available unfilled jobs in the country, almost 400,000 in construction, for instance, and when inflation is so problematic across the countryside. Because the Federal Reserve looked at these data, and they tell us they're data-driven, and says, I cannot live with these rates of unemployment. I can't get to my 2% inflation mandate when there's almost no one left to hire. The highest rates of unemployment here in Southern California are well less than 5%. Some of these markets is close to 2%. We've had around 5% wage growth over the past year. To get back to 2% inflation, you probably need something between 3 and 3.5%. So a lot of people out there, including investors, think the Federal Reserve is done, that the July 26th rate increase was the final rate increase in this series of rate increases, but they could be wrong about that. Because I think inflation is going to stay stubbornly high. I think there could be further rate increases going forward. I think we'll get some negative surprises on inflation. In other words, inflation is going to turn out to be higher than anticipated. There's something called base effects. So in June of 2022, inflation came in really hot. So when you benchmark June of 2023 against June of 2022, inflation looks more benign 1 year later. But now you've got comparisons, inflation comparisons, where inflation was less hot during the subsequent months of 2022, and so all of a sudden the 2023 numbers may not look as good from an inflation fighting perspective. So if I'm right, interest rates are already high and they could rise further, and then on top of that you've got more difficult credit conditions. Why is that? Well, because we had the failure of Silicon Valley Bank on March 10th and Signature Bank on March 12th, and then the issues at First Republic and PacWest and Western Alliance, not to mention Deutsche Bank and Credit Suisse and so on and so forth. Credit conditions appear to be tightening, particularly as it relates to real estate and to a certain extent construction. So cost of capital is high, could rise further. Capital availability is becoming constrained by these banking issues, more scrutiny from regulators, and that obviously raises the risk of recession. Again, 1996, Jerry Maguire, I cried. I wept, freely and happily. So again, we're not in recession now, but there are some indications. Now, before I talk about the likelihood of recession, let me define it for you. I mentioned a moment ago that we sustained those 2 consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth during the first half of 2022, satisfying the technical or atypical definition of recession, but not the definition of recession. This is the definition of recession. The National Bureau of Economic Research's Business Cycle Dating Committee is the official recession scorekeeper. They're the arbiter of when recessions begin, when they end, if they occurred at all. And accordingly, they're the ones that maintain a chronology of U.S. business cycles. They're the ones, for instance, who told us in 2002, as the recession of 2001 began in March of 2001 and ended in November of 2001. Their official definition of recession, or traditional definition of recession, is, quote, a significant decline in economic activity that spread across the economy and that lasts more than a few months. Except the recession they declared in 2020 begins in February of 2020, ends in April of 2020, arguably not more than a few months. They declared it a recession nonetheless. Because why? Because they can. They are the definition of recession. If it's recession to them, it is recession, period. What's more, there is no fixed rule about which indicators contribute information to NBER's process or how they are weighted in the determination of recession. They can look at whatever they please. They can look at the price of Bitcoin, which today was below 29,000. They can look at whatever they please. Now, as a practical matter, they look at retail sales, industrial production, job growth, wage growth, gross domestic product, so on. But they can look at whatever they please and weight them accordingly, according to their preferences. And because the government statistics NBR relies on are published at various lags, the committee cannot officially designate a recession until after it starts and often not until it's over, which was the 2020 episode. The recession was, the economy was opened in February of 2020, at least partially shut down in March of 2020. We knew the recession had begun, but they could not declare one at that time because the confirming data had yet to arrive, and that would take a couple of months. So that's the definition. Again, we're not in recession now, but there's some indication that the economy is becoming a bit more ragged. I'll give you an example. For much of this pandemic recovery period, I think the mantra among many CEOs was, let me chase demand. The economy is coming back very, very quickly. There's lots of unmet demand out there. If I hire the workers, if I obtain the warehouse space, lease the equipment, purchase the equipment, so on and so forth, I expand my capacity to deliver to the marketplace, I can win market share. And in an inflationary environment, I can monetize that market share. Again, corporate profits are positively correlated with inflation. You can bury more margin into one's pricing. There's less transparency there with respect to pricing. But I think more recently, more CEOs are concluding, maybe I need to rethink my approach to the macroeconomy. Maybe instead of chasing demand, I need to think more about my cost structure. Maybe I've taken on too much cost. Maybe I've made some bad hires. So this comes from the gross domestic product data. This is non-residential fixed investment in equipment. This is equipment purchases. Just got the second quarter data in. In 2 of the last 3 quarters, equipment purchases are down. They came back, it's true, during the second quarter of 2023, but even during the second quarter of 2023, they're less than they were 3 quarters prior. More CEOs, I think, are thinking more about their cost structures, maybe set to hire less aggressively. So, for instance, what happened here? Something bad happened here. Something very bad. There it is. So, according to a November 2022 PwC survey of U.S. executives, 26% of firms are planning to reduce the number of full-time employees over the next 12 to 18 months. Now, based on the employment data, it would appear that a lot of these intentions have yet to be activated or actualized. That's true. Nonetheless, there are more CEOs thinking about the possibility of recession, thinking about maybe the way to maximize my bottom line is not through chasing demand, but by thinking about also cutting some costs. In August of 2022, 50% of firms said they already had or had a plan in place to reduce overall headcount. The thought is there. 4 to 5 executives surveyed by PwC in November of 2022 said a recession is coming in the next 6 months. Now, they're wrong about that. That was said 9 months ago, 10 months ago almost now. No recession in sight, as far as I can tell. Though, obviously, there's always a possibility the recession will turn downward quickly. We'll talk about that in a moment. But nonetheless, they're nervous. And in fact, some CEOs have announced layoffs recently. They have been containing headcount. So here's some layoffs, some prominent ones from 2022 and 2023. At the top of the list is Amazon. The CEO there is Andy Jassy. He has announced 2 layoffs in recent months, the last one being 9,000, totaling 27,000. But something else CEO Jassy did. He said to his white-collar workforce, you have to come into our offices 3 days a week. 3 days in 1 week. You have to come to work. Are we barbarians? Is this how you treat people? Now, my guess is this was done to foment collaboration, innovation, and supervision, but also try to get some people to quit, which some people have quit feeling disrespected by management. You can see Meta here, announcement of 21,000 layoffs. The CEO there is, of course, Mark Zuckerberg, one of America's finest and brightest CEOs in my humble estimation. In any case, 21,000 layoffs. Now, he has declared this the year of efficiency at Meta. During a recent earnings call, he said the words efficient or efficiency 41 times. So even as he's been spending more on the metaverse and artificial intelligence, cutting back on certain other costs, and his stock price, as you know, up more than 100% over the past year. And many CEOs are likely to copy that kind of behavior. When they see a CEO growing their bottom line, delighting shareholders and the board in the process, including the compensation committee, so my goodness, maybe the pathway is not just through chasing demand, maybe I need to cut more costs. And again, one of the engines or one of the motivations behind this thinking might be that the cost of capital and therefore the cost of investing and growing capacity is higher than it used to be. Interest rates are higher than they used to be, and this would have a tendency to impact interest rate segments of the economy more significantly, including real estate and construction. Let's talk about that now. 1992, A Few Good Men playing the part of Lieutenant Daniel Kaffee. So I began this presentation talking about interest rates, right place to begin, I think. That's just really shaping the trajectory of the economy, has been. Let me show you two more interest rates, two interest rates of interest. The 30-year fixed mortgage rate in gold, the 50-year fixed mortgage rate in green. Green and gold, of course, the color of money, which was a 1986 Tom Cruise film, also starring Paul Newman, playing the part of Fast Eddie Felson. Now, back in January of 2022, the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate is 3.22%. According to Freddie Mac, the most recent weekly data, 6.81%. Now, so you might say to me, Anirban, 6.81% 30-year fixed mortgage rate is not a big deal. My first mortgage rate was 18%. My first mortgage rate was 15%. I've had people come up to me after presentations bragging about the fact that they used to pay 15% interest. I am not impressed. But it is an interesting history, and for those folks, 6.81% might not seem especially onerous. But to millennials and Generation Z, these rates are preposterously high. They've not seen this before. And that's who's really subtracted themselves from the prospective home purchasing market is that would-be first-time buyer, frustrated by low inventory, high prices, and now quite high mortgage rates by their standards. Now, that said, one might think that the housing market must be in very bad shape. I mean, I'm going to show you a number of leading economic indicators as I move toward the tail end of this presentation, because I want to pivot from a discussion of what's been happening to a discussion of what's likely to happen during the year ahead. So as it turns out, the home purchasing process often begins with a mortgage application. That's where the process begins. So this is the Mortgage Loan Application Composite Index. And this index suggests that mortgage applications are down something like 80% from the 2021 peak. And again, who's really subtracted themselves from the equation? Millennials and Generation Z are would-be first-time buyers. And so you would say, my goodness, with demand so truncated by these higher mortgage rates, the housing market must be in awful shape. The single-family, at least, portion of the housing market must be in horrible shape. And as you probably heard, it is not. And this has been one of the many ways in which the economy has surprised me. For instance, home price dynamics. This is the S&P Case-Shiller U.S. National Home Price Index. And as mortgage rates took off, no surprise, after a period of phenomenal growth in home valuations, you can see home prices actually start to fall for a time. And I thought that would continue. Why? Mortgage applications are down, mortgage rates are higher, the number of would-be or prospective buyers has shrunk. But no, not at all. People are still transacting all cash deals. Often, people who are quite high net worth that are purchasing these homes. Scanned inventory, there's enough of them out there to buy these homes, not so sensitive to interest rates. You can break this down by market as well. So this is the S&P Case-Shiller Home Price Index by metropolitan area over the past 12 months. So if you look toward the top of the slide, technology-intensive markets like Seattle and San Francisco, negative performance over the last 12 months, that's true. But in some markets, again, Cleveland, Chicago, Miami, Charlotte, Atlanta, again, you can see some of the primacy of the American South here, you would not know that mortgage rates have taken off. And overall, home prices are roughly back to where they had when at their peak, even though mortgage rates have not begun to adjust downward, at least not in any meaningful way. So this is the 12-month percentage change in home prices for these measured metropolitan areas. These are part of the S&P Case-Shiller Index. Not every metropolitan area is. So if this is the last 12 months, what if I showed you just the last month of data? If I just showed you May of 2023's price dynamics, just for the 1 month, this is what you would get. So the 0% axis is your left-hand axis. Everything is seeing home price appreciation. Every market in the country. Remarkable. And I think that's what I underestimated, the willingness of people to continue to transact when the cost of capital had taken off. The economy has been surprisingly resilient in the face of that higher cost of capital. When I was in school studying economics, it was really the monetary economists who excited me, the Alan Drazens and Guillermo Calvos. And when I look back in history, people like Milton Friedman and Ben Bernanke, that's who I read, the monetarists. So, when interest rates take off, I get very excited as a, person who focuses on monetary economics. I think, the economy is going to slump. That's what monetary theory tells us. Of course, in graduate school, I didn't refer to myself as a monetarist. I said I was a neo-Keynesian because I wanted to be attracted to women, obviously. But the point is I was a monetarist. So this has been a very difficult time for monetary economists because the economy has not functioned the way we thought. And of course, this very strong price performance, at least recently, has an impact on construction. That's part of the economy. Another leading indicator of this is U.S. residential building permits. The yellow line there is single-family building permits. And yes, there was a period during which, as prices were falling, home builders were permitting less. Why is a leading indicator? Because if you're a developer, you've got to pull a permit, or you've got to pull a permit before you build. But now you can see permits coming back. Where do you see the weakness here? It's actually the green line, the multifamily category. That includes apartment construction. Why is that? We can say, Anirban, that doesn't make any sense. If the millennials are a large generation, most populous generation, so if the millennials can't find a home that they can afford or want, given scant inventory and high prices, they're going to rent. The logic is pretty simple, right? You can actually look at the restaurant industry to give you the same logic. There's a restaurant chain out there known as Checkers. I don't know if you've ever heard of this restaurant chain, Checkers. For many, many years, their slogan has been, you got to eat. You got to eat. That's their value proposition, you got to eat. I view that as the worst slogan in the history of U.S. corporate enterprises. Yes, you got to eat, but not at Checkers, because you've got some choices, most importantly, of course, Red Robin. But same thing in housing. If you're not going to buy a single-family home, you're going to rent an apartment. So there's lots of demand to lease apartments, given the demographics and the economics of the situation, and yet multifamily permitting is sort of sagging here. You can see that pretty aggressively, as it turns out most recently. Why is that? I don't think it's because of the demand side for apartments. This is a supply-side issue. That developers are having a tougher time lining up financing for projects, that a lot of bankers in particular don't want to be exposed to real estate under these circumstances. And that's also true for commercial real estate as well, though I don't want to paint that with too broad of a brush. There's many commercial real estate segments, some are still quite strong. But this is a leading indicator of commercial real estate dynamics, to the extent that you can talk about commercial real estate as a single entity. So this is the Architecture Billings Index. It's a reflection of how busy architects are. You see the 50-yard line running west-east across that slide. Any reading above 50 means that architects are busier this month than they were last month. And you can see that for much of the pandemic recovery period, architects were getting busier and busier and busier. Why is that? Well, the economy, of course, was coming back very, very quickly. But also investors were looking for income. You'll remember that interest rates were very low, very difficult to generate income from the bond portion of one's portfolio. But real estate generates income. It generates apartment rents and office rents and hotel daily rates and so on and so forth. And when people are pouring money into real estate, that often triggers design and construction work as properties are repositioned in the marketplace or built from scratch. But in 2022, fixed income gets its last name back. All of a sudden, you can generate income by buying bonds, for instance. And for 6 of the past 8 months, the Architecture Billings Index has been below that threshold 50 reading. And I think that there's more of this to come, that commercial real estate, again, there are many segments of commercial real estate, but certain of them, some of them, stand to be quite weak going forward from a developer and therefore from a construction standpoint. And the best example, I think, is obvious. It's the office market. This is the office vacancy rate. You can see it ended last year at 12.5%, but that's misleading. Because a lot more space is vacant than 12.5%, as you know, but it's not deemed to be vacant because it's still leased. But as these lease renewals come up, you'll see that office vacancy will continue to rise. About $1.5 trillion in commercial real estate-related debt that has to be refinanced between now and the end of 2025. Who's going to refinance that debt? Who wants to be so exposed to real estate, especially the office market? So lots of distressed sales in the office market are coming. You can't convert every office building to an apartment or mixed use, floor plates and other issues. And so this is one of the segments that stands to be quite weak going forward. Now, here's the good news. I know that this presentation has taken a turn for the worse. I get that. It's become pessimistic and dour. But here's the good news. As an economist, I can tell you whatever story you want to hear. You want me to tell you the economy is great and go on CNN and do that? I can do that. You want me to tell you the economy is terrible and go on Fox News and do that? I can do that. Whatever story you want me to tell, I can tell you because I have enough data to support any story. Now, in fact, I want to tell 2 separate stories using 1 slide and 1 data series right now. This is total non-residential construction spending. You see the line that ends at the top, that lighter green card line? That's total non-residential construction spending. And you say, Anirban, my goodness, phenomenal rebound from the pandemic. Fantastic amount of spending on non-residential construction. What a recovery, phenomenal. Yeah, that's true, but that number is not adjusted for inflation. If you adjust for inflation, you'll get that dark green card line. And you look at that and you say, my goodness, we barely have growth since 2019, pre-pandemic, in terms of actual non-residential construction in this country. Non-residential is everything we don't live in. It's roads, bridges, office buildings, hospitals, data centers, so on and so forth. No growth. Well, how can that be, Anirban? You just said construction had 339,000 jobs since February of 2020. Granted, most of those jobs are added on the residential side of the industry, that's true, but non-residential has added jobs too, and yet the output from the industry has not grown basically at all in the last 4 years. How can that be? We have more workers, but not more output. How can that be? Because their productivity has declined. And why has their productivity declined? Because some of our finest construction workers retired early during the pandemic. Those baby boomers. The people who brought their A game to the job site each and every day. Who learned their love of working with equipment, hands and minds, simultaneously early in life, often in shop class in high school. They've been refining their skills for decades. Shop classes, you remember, taught by someone with enormous arms wearing a rush t-shirt and driving a Trans Am. But that kind of person has been weeded out of the curriculum. Young people, decreasingly, are interested in the construction trades. There's a listing out there, a recent survey of what are the top 10 aspirations of young people, what industries are they most interested in. And there's music and entertainment and other industries. At number 10, anything doesn't matter. Anything doesn't matter is above construction in terms of aspiration. I'll do anything, whatever. So that's where we are. Among the fastest growing occupational segments in construction is unskilled laborer. So the construction industry, desperate for talent, is actually bringing people on who don't have much training, don't have much background in construction. They're hoping they'll show up to work sober, that they will show themselves to be reliable enough to be trained up to become productive construction professionals. But productivity in the industry, as far as I can tell, has fallen recently in large measure again because of retirement. And many contractors will tell you that our finest construction workers, our most skilled construction workers are set to retire at some point in the next 5 to 10 years. So that's where we are. And that makes delivering capital projects, large ones, that much more difficult. Now, I can break this down by segments. So this is non-residential construction spending by subsector growth between February of 2020, the month before we shut down the economy, and June of 2023. As it turns out, we got June of 2023 data this morning, so I was able to update the slide. But the runaway winner here is manufacturing. And that is a reflection of this newfound industrial policymaking in America, where government is stepping in and saying, there are certain activities we insist will be in this country. You could argue it begins under the Trump administration with the emphasis on steel and aluminum production, but certainly it's continued to the Biden administration. Electric vehicles, batteries, computer chips, so on and so forth. Around $250 billion in computer chip manufacturing plants under development in this country. That's New York State, Ohio, Arizona, Texas. Global Wafer, Texas Instruments, so on and so forth in the state, quite active. $40 billion at least of battery manufacturing plants are development in this country. So it is really that capital project, that rebuilding our supply chains while we're rebuilding our infrastructure, that mega project. This is the era of that mega project. But you need good construction workers to help you deliver those projects. We don't have enough of them, at least as far as I can tell. So delivering these projects can become very, very expensive. Now, you can see at the bottom of the list is lodging. These numbers, by the way, are not adjusted for inflation. Lodging, that's your hotel room construction, largely a reflection of the fact that business travel has not come back very aggressively, even though leisure travel has. And then office, even though the fact that office includes data center construction continues to be fast, furious, and frenetic. And I suspect, given artificial intelligence, will continue to be. But that weakness is a reflection of the traditional office market. And you may have seen a report recently indicating that the amount of office space available in America is actually shrinking as more office space is being torn down or being repurposed than is actually being built. Again, a reflection of that very weak office segment. Final part of this part of the presentation, one of the positives here is what's happened with materials prices. So anyone trying to deliver construction projects on time and on budget, of course, have been frustrated by massive increases in materials prices, but that appears to be at an end. I'm not saying that all supply chain issues have dissipated, but we have seen improvements in the supply chain. This is your inputs to construction producer price index. It's a measure of wholesale level inflation. 12-month percentage change. You can see that for a time we're looking at 20 to 25% inflation in terms of construction materials. But over the past year, for which we have data, again, through June of 2023, materials prices down 4.9%. And again, as I've done with other indicators, I can break this down for you. So again, this is construction materials prices. This is the last 12 months. The headline number, again, up above, negative 4.9%. You can see that a lot of the deflation in materials prices is attributable to energy price declines, natural gas, crude energy materials prices, crude petroleum prices, but also steel and softwood lumber. There is inflation in the concrete category. There's a global shortage of cement. Nonetheless, for the most part, a lot of these supply chains have improved. again, not across the board. I spoke recently to a group, in fact, Friday, to the Mechanical Contract Association of Texas. And they told me that their lead time for switchgear is something like 25 weeks, or lead time for generators, something similar to that. But that's better, because I had given a similar presentation 2 months earlier to the Mechanical Contract Association of Washington, D.C., and they told me at that time, 2 months ago, their lead time for switchgear and generators was something like 50, 60, 70 weeks. So even along that dimension, lead times are falling. And yes, I'm not saying, again, these supply chain issues are completely dissipated, but we seem to be improving along that dimension, which is one of the reasons, by the way, that inflation has been falling. Okay, enough of that. Let's go to the forecast now, shall we? And then I'll take some questions, of course. Hopefully you'll have some. This is a 2014 Tom Cruise film, science fiction film. Not a great film in my judgment, certainly not my favorite Tom Cruise film in the interest of full disclosure, but an amazing transition slide. So it made the cut nonetheless as we go to the forecast. Now, I mentioned that the economy continues to demonstrate a fair amount of momentum. And I have admitted that I've been surprised by that resiliency. I would have thought the economy would have been softer by now, given these various headwinds, particularly higher costs of capital, and also more restrictive lending environment, given the recent regional bank failures. But there are some leading indicators suggesting that the risk of recession is still there. Here's one of those leading indicators. This is the Conference Board's Index of Leading Economic Indicators. This is 10 leading indicators bundled into one composite index, which I'm graphing for you here. This is an index that predicted the 2001 recession, predicted the 07, 08, 09 downturn, and now is telling us that something more wicked this way comes. But a pretty good leading indicator. And it reflects things like lending conditions, so on and so forth, and it's telling us it's going to get a bit tougher economically, that we're not out of the woods yet. That anyone that thinks that, yes, we have managed to engineer a soft landing, or the Federal Reserve has, may not turn out to be correct. There are things like the inventory cycle working against us. This is business inventories, 3 slices here. The slice at the top is your retail inventories in green. Now, I mentioned that retailers sustained monthly losses in retail activity in November, December of last year, February and March of this year. Many retailers have found that they have to discount more aggressively to move merchandise. So we've heard weakness at Macy's, Target, Home Depot, often serving that middle market discretionary customer. And retailers do not like to discount merchandise to move it. And when they see that they have to discount to do that, they order less from the merchant wholesalers, which is the orange segment there. That's your distributors, your middlemen and women. You can see that wholesale inventories have risen quite significantly recently. And when wholesalers see their inventories rise, they order less from the manufacturers. You can see manufacturing inventories have risen as well. Today we got a report from the Institute for Supply Management. All the manufacturing indices were below 50, meaning that manufacturing is still in retrenchment. So even as we talk about all this supply chaining in America, all this new capacity that's about to come online in the next 1, 2, 3 years, right now manufacturing is, at least based on certain measures, already in its own idiosyncratic recession. So these measures, some of them suggest that the risk of recession is still there. This next measure screams that recession is coming. This is your yield curve. Again, 2 interest rates of interest, the yield on the 1-year Treasury in gold, the yield on the 10-year Treasury in green. Now, typically you'd expect the interest rate on a 10-year instrument to be meaningfully above that on a 1-year instrument. So if I'm buying a U.S. Treasury, a 10-year U.S. Treasury, I'm lending to the federal government for 10 years. That's what I'm doing. I'm not going to see my principal for a decade. And so I'm going to demand more interest in the interim to reward me for my patience. Conversely, if I buy a 1-year U.S. Treasury, I'll see my principal back risk-free, basically, now that we're through debt ceiling in 12 months. I don't have to be so patient. I'm not being so patient. Therefore, I don't want it to be so richly rewarded. But occasionally, the bond market goes topsy-turvy, inside out, upside down, Diana Ross. And the yield on the 1-year, again here in gold, goes above the yield on the 10-year here in green. Now, these gray shaded areas are periods of recession dating back several decades. So when do you see the gold line, again, the yield on the 1-year, go above the green line, the yield on the 10-year? Just before the 1970 recession, before 73, 74, 75, before 1980, before 81, 82, before 1990, 1991, before 2001, before 07, 08, 09. Not so much before 2020, that was caused something else, but now we've got this massive inversion, bless you, in the yield curve. So today, the yield on the 1-year is about 133 basis points, or 1.33 percentage points above the yield on the 10-year. The yield on the 10-year just went above 4%, but 4.06% as I got up here. And it's been a pretty good predictor of recessions for decades, and now it's telling us, the bond market is telling us, recession is coming. Stock market doesn't. Of course, equity prices are rallying still, not today so much, sort of flat on the equity markets today in the United States. But over the last few months, equity markets have surged, suggesting that the stock market, at least, does not think a recession is coming. The bond market does. Now, who do I believe? I believe the bond market. Why? Because they're from Chicago. They don't have martinis at lunch because they don't have lunch. They just look at spreadsheets all day. They're very serious, as opposed to the Wall Streeters who, for the most part, like to have a good time. So I'm going to go with the bond market here, but I could be wrong because, again, the economy is surprised to the upside, very much so. And Bloomberg last year had an index that came out with a prediction there's a 100% chance of recession, 100%. You actually can't get more than that, except in sports, of course, when athletes can give 110%. But otherwise, 100% is the maximum. So I've been surprised, but I think recession is still coming, and maybe, just maybe, you can't handle the truth. Though you might point out to me, Anirban, that's not the truth, that's your forecast. And you admitted several times the economy has not worked out the way you anticipated. Fair enough. You may also point out to me, that was not said by Tom Cruise, that was said by Jack Nicholson in 1992, A Few Good Men. Also fair. Jack Nicholson playing the part of Colonel Nathan Jessup. And Colonel Nathan Jessup is on the stand. And he is being grilled by a young military attorney who is adroitly asking a series of questions that eventually elicits that response, which is an admission of guilt. And that young military attorney, Lieutenant Daniel Kaffee, is played by one young and, in my judgment, quite handsome Tom Cruise. I think the economy gets worse before it gets better. I think you'll see the economic activity dissipate after Labor Day. We know the summer is going to be busy from a travel and spending perspective. We can see bookings, hotel bookings, airline bookings, so on and so forth. The consumer is still spending. But after Labor Day, there will be a reckoning, I think. More and more consumers wake up to the fact that they've amassed a ton of credit card debt, that now they have to start paying back their student loans, or at least interest is starting to build if they don't pay those student loans. Credit conditions are tightening, and we have all those lag effects built into the economy from all those previous interest rate hikes by the Federal Reserve. So you put that together, I think, the economy is headed for a recession. Now, on top of that, the global economy is weakening, whether it's in Europe, the United Kingdom is still very weak. Interest rates are still rising there in the face of excess inflation. The Chinese economy, of course, is very, very weak. The national economy is weakening, in my judgment at least. Borrowing costs are higher, that's incontrovertible, and excess inflation persists, that's incontrovertible. Some segments tend to hold better than others, including public construction, obviously, infrastructure spending, and a lot of public contractors have said to me, Anirban, the reason why more money from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which was signed by President Biden on November 15th of 2021, has not hit the economy is because of these Buy America provisions. And they're tough to satisfy. But the expectation is that more of this money will actually hit the economy later this year and in 2024. Grocery stores, you got to eat, and then multifamily housing from a leasing perspective, though not from a developer perspective, and in fact, rent increases are starting to dissipate in much of the country. At some point, the Federal Reserve will stop raising rates, and more importantly, will start cutting them. Even if the Federal Reserve does not raise rates again, interest rates are high enough to suppress economic growth going forward. And again, you've got all these lag effects built into the economy from those previous rate increases that have yet to be apparent in the data. So that's what's really going to take to rejuvenate U.S. economic momentum, I think, at least post-Labor Day, which is rate cuts to get this economy going again, and I don't expect that to happen until 2024. So I think recession conditions will prevail at some point in the next 12 months. I've had this bullet point in place for many, many months. Eventually, I will be correct. I will be correct. So I'm just not going to change this until I'm correct. So in any case, that's my forecast. If you're interested in this kind of analysis, I have a newsletter now at www.sagecon.com. There's a free service here, so I'm not necessarily dialing for dollars, but if you're not interested, please feel free to pound sand. And with that, I thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today. It has been a privilege. Let's go to Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anirban. I don't know about you. I feel like I just went through a college course in an hour and need to take a breath, but very, very interesting and insightful conversation, so thank you.
Do we have any time for Q&A?
Yes, we do.
Oh, good. Okay,
yeah,
good.
I'm not kicking you off yet.
Oh, that's what I thought was happening, actually. Okay,
I just wanted to acknowledge I need to take
you.
a breath because you ran through that.
No, I did.
All right. First question. There's a large labor pipeline shortage in our construction industry. So what advice do you have for our companies in a little bit more detail to really tackle that?
Look, it's a hard question to answer, right? Because one does not need to be or want to be academic and impractical. What is it that people want from their jobs? I mean, if you're competing for scarce human capital, so how do you outcompete another firm for that same human capital? What do you offer? Obviously, compensation plays a part. But I think especially for these young workers, they care about the workplace condition and they care about flexibility. I'm a member of Generation X. You could bribe us to work harder. Money really mattered to us. Because what we were aspiring to as young people, what did we want? We obviously wanted a free Nelson Mandela, but after that, we wanted a 3 Series BMW. That's all we wanted. I bought mine in 1997, 328 XI Montreal Blue. So that's what we wanted. These young people, they don't care as much about money, which is their problem. Because they'll talk about, we want work-life balance, which what does that mean? Not much work, lots of life. And that does not generate lots of output at the job site, I gotta tell you. So what can I tell you? A lot of what these young people seem to want is things like social mission. So we are greening the economy. We're providing investment in communities that have heretofore been neglected. Whatever that messaging can be that message should be front and foremost, along with compensation, along with as much flexibility as you can offer. But you can't offer much flexibility often at the construction job site because you have to work in teams. And you have to work at certain hours, permitted by local government or state government or wherever it happens to be. And so what can I tell you? That's the way to get to talent. And remote work is not yet a possibility in many cases in construction, as it turns out. So it's a challenge.
Sure. Follow-up question to that. How can our companies use technology and even AI to perhaps attract that talent and tackle some of these challenges?
Right. So the question with respect to artificial intelligence, which is the big theme of 2023, it seems to me, and I could be dead wrong about this, that this gets to construction management, construction design of the project. People are talking about, we talked about, you used to talk about design, bid, build, and then design, build, and contractor at risk, and now it's integrated project delivery, whatever the model happens to be. But of course, artificial intelligence allows for better data sharing, easier data sharing, more accurate data, so on and so forth, with respect to how a project is progressing. So fantastic. But as a practical matter, much of construction has a physical component to it. You're laying brick, you're working with cement and concrete, so on and so forth. You're dealing with steel girders. And artificial intelligence cannot help you with that so much. It can help you avoid certain types of errors, perhaps, but you need human beings to do a lot of this construction work. And artificial intelligence does not get us out of that box, and that's where many of the shortages are. It's among those skilled craftspeople, though, of course, we have a shortage of construction managers as well.
Sure. Okay. Next question. You mentioned earlier on about seeing the trend of retail sales doubling over the past 20 years. I'm curious if you anticipate that continuing, and particularly to the conversation earlier today around energy. What is the impact on energy usage that impacts?
Right. So, do I expect retail sales to continue as they have gone? No, I do not. And why is that? Because I think America's facing some tough years in the next decade. So I did not talk about it, but we have a $32 trillion national debt. Our Medicare trust fund goes insolvent in 2031. Our Social Security trust fund goes insolvent in 2033, according to the most recent trustees' reports. And right now we're readying ourselves as a country to see a lot of public investment in our infrastructure. We see a lot of tax credits being offered to private companies that are developing the semiconductor manufacturing capacity, so on and so forth. But at some point, this national debt's going to catch up to us. And I would think that it's at some point in the next decade. So given that all of a sudden you're going to have a government on its back foot, able to less aggressively invest in the economy, whether it's education or infrastructure, whatever it happens to be, transportation, that we're not going to see living standards grow as quickly as we have seen them, therefore retail sales are not going to climb as quickly. Now, with respect to energy, what do I expect to happen with respect to energy prices? I expect them to fall. And that probably sounds naive, but over time. I know that energy prices have been rising recently. We were at high 60s in terms of oil prices today, $81 a barrel. I get that. But at the long term, given that we're seeing so much progress coming down the cost curve in terms of how much it costs for solar to generate electricity, how much it costs for wind to generate electricity, as we come down that cost curve, and we still have this abundance of natural gas supply in this country, of course, the largest deposits in the world, I would think that energy prices at some point are going to fall. And that will help America, obviously, a lot, get through this awkward transition to renewables. Nonetheless, that's what I expect with respect to retail sales and the economy. I'm quite worried about the next decade. I've only given you a one-year outlook today because I want to invoice you again. But if I look longer term, there's some major issues out there for America. Yeah.
Sure. What's the bigger impact that our industry could have on the broader economy if we really increase the number of women in construction?
Look, that would be a phenomenal thing, right? So it's a demographic issue. Construction, a recent study suggested that about 87% of construction is male. So women have been heretofore very much underrepresented, especially in the skilled construction trades. So if we can reach out to demographics who have been underrepresented in construction, so much the better. Add to population, add to the number of skilled workers. If we can do a better job improving our built environment more inexpensively, more efficiently, so much the better. Imagine two societies, one in which you have a skilled construction workforce and one in which you don't. But they're alike in all other facets, along all other dimensions. Who's going to perform better over time? Obviously, it's a country that can improve its built environment faster, accommodate the new technologies of the future faster, allow people to be more efficiently moved, goods to be more efficiently moved. We don't have that. We're quite inefficient along those dimensions. And so it's an opportunity for vast improvement in economic outcomes. And if we had more women join the construction trades or construction generally, obviously advantage America.
Yeah, fantastic. So you talked mostly about the United States with your data, but could you share a little bit of insight around how other markets around the world are doing?
Yeah, I would say, if the Canadian economy, of course, is the 10th largest economy in the world, very similar, 38 million people roughly, same kind of performance as us, surging residential construction spending, non-residential building construction has been much flatter there. It's exactly what we see in America, very low unemployment in Canada by their standards, mid-fives. Last I checked, 5.4%. So that's Canada. Mexico, their unemployment rate is even lower. Actually, lots of activity in Mexico, as it turns out. Not a very rapidly growing economy, but growing nonetheless. So we have growth across North America. If you look at the fastest growing economies in the world, India, 6%, Indonesia, 6% growth. The Chinese economy is slumping. Yesterday, the Chinese announced some more fiscal policy measures to try to stimulate that economy, more aggressive lending to the real estate sector, that kind of thing. But that economy has been the biggest disappointment so far this year. This is a reopening year for the Chinese economy. So it was shut down to varying degrees in 2022. It reopened in 2023. So the expectation was there'd be this significant growth in the Chinese economy, and that would be the global economic engine this year. It has not proven to be the case. And part of that is real estate, the real estate issue there, the local government indebtedness crisis there, all those kinds of things. So it depends on where you look. The European economy is just stuck in the mud. Quite high rates of inflation still, more interest rate increases to come from the European Central Bank and the Bank of England, and those economies are just not growing particularly rapidly. So the European economy is really quite stuck in the mud. And then finally, the Latin American economies, also quite weak economic growth because the giant of Latin America is Brazil, and the Brazilians just aren't going anywhere economically right now.
All right. How much is wage inflation driving this atypical economy reaction to what you
this
described?
is an interesting one because I would say that wage inflation really matters. And I would say to you that the reason that I think inflation is going to stay stickier in the economy, and therefore the Federal Reserve might have to make some more moves on interest rates, is because of wage inflation. Why is that? Because the labor market is still very tight, American employers are still looking to hire more people, and they're just not available, right? 1.6 job openings for every unemployed American. But a recent Federal Reserve paper came out suggesting that, wage inflation really does not have that much impact on overall inflation. Now, I read the paper, I didn't understand how it could come to that conclusion, but it did. And as it turns out, we've had all this wage inflation, that's true, and yet inflation has been coming down, hasn't it? And there's a component in the consumer price index, which is the shelter component. It's about 33.4% of the overall consumer price index measure. And the expectation is that the shelter component is really going to see a lot of disinflation going forward, which if you're already at 3% inflation and the shelter component comes down even more, and that's a third of your computation, then that's one of the reasons that many economists say the inflation fight has been won. We have a soft landing in place. The Federal Reserve doesn't have to do anything more. It's done. It's won. And we predicted recession before. We're not predicting anymore. I'm not changing my outlook, not yet. I still think that you'll see some sticky inflation because I think wages do matter to overall inflation. It just makes sense to me, and so we shall see.
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how major construction is funded again. It seems like these days there's a lot of government funding with IJA and IRA and the others. Is that too much reliance on the government for this funding, or are there benefits that you see?
Oh, that's a very tough question. We economists for decades, what do we advocate for, at least collectively? Laissez-faire. So let the United States enter into these free trade agreements, World Trade Organization, NAFTA, whatever it happens to be, and let the free marketplace operating globally tell us which industries should be located where. Right? Let the laws of comparative advantage tell us which industries should be located in whatever destination. But I think many policymakers, economists, and others concluded that, you know what, it's fine to have free trade, but you also need to have fair trade. And Americans have not benefited from fair trade. At least that's the common perception among many Americans. And so, given that, all of a sudden Americans have shifted, to a certain extent at least, away from globalization and toward industrial policy, where government steps in and says, there are certain industries we want present here. Again, computer chip manufacturing, steel, aluminum, electric vehicles, inputs to alternative energy, so on and so forth. So one could argue whether or not this is a good or bad thing. Many economists favoring laissez-faire might say, well, this is not a good thing. Government should not be picking winners. But I personally think it's actually quite a wonderful thing that some of these supply chains are coming back to America, that America is becoming more independent along some of these dimensions, including in terms of energy, or at least potentially. I know there's a big controversy about oil and natural gas. But eventually independent in terms of energy. And so I think it's quite positive. And what can I tell you? It's really good for those who manage capital projects because ultimately it translates to more large-scale capital projects. But that also means that if we want to use these government resources more efficiently, there's a $32 trillion national debt, that this audience needs to do as good a job delivering these capital projects as is possible because the government's already strained and another generation of money is not coming from the government. So we have to figure out, if we haven't figured out already, how to deliver major capital projects more efficiently because the next set of projects will not be government subsidized or government financed.
Sure. All right. Someone wants to know if the price of copper provides a leading indicator for economy direction.
Yeah, so the price of copper, which I believe has been somewhat below $4 recently, or around $4, is a leading indicator for global economic growth. So, copper is used for wiring and all kinds of other things. So I have not seen much movement in the price of copper recently. It's difficult to produce, by the way, more copper. So supply is relatively inelastic because it takes a long time to create, copper mining operations, so on and so forth. Supply is pretty inelastic. So when you see surging demand, you can see copper prices take off very, very quickly. But we haven't seen that, have we? And again, the global economy is quite weak, particularly the Chinese economy again. And the Chinese are massive users of construction materials. And the weakness of the Chinese economy is one of the reasons that materials prices are down 5% over the past year. So I have not, as far as copper as a leading global economic indicator, it suggests that the global economy is set to remain weak for the foreseeable future.
Sure, okay. 2 real estate questions. Would you invest in real estate right now?
Oh, yes. If I were this kind of capitalist, so I'm a capitalist, I'm a small business owner, but if I were the kind of capitalist that took other people's money and deployed it in investments, tried to generate them a rate of return for them, what would I be doing right now? I'd be amassing a massive amount of capital to invest in distressed real estate. Because right now you've got a lot of owners of properties. These buildings have not been cash flowing for several years. They have to refinance to much higher rates of interest. So what was a 6% interest rate they might have faced is now 13, 14%. Buildings are already not cash flowing, but even more as they have to refinance this debt. And so there's going to be a lot of distressed sales out there. I'll give you an example. In my city of Baltimore, we had a building at 1 South Street, which is a very prominent building on our skyline. In October of 2015, that building sold for $66 million. Last month it sold, I should say in June now, we're not in August. June it sold for $24 million. And that's a building close to our inner harbor, close to the Pratt Street corridor, a fairly amenity-rich environment. You can go to Capitol Grill for lunch, that kind of thing. I wonder what's happening to buildings further away from our waterfront, how much damage is being done to those valuations. So those owners of those buildings, and of course the people who hold the paper on those buildings, stand to suffer significant losses. So there's going to be opportunities for people who have capital right now to invest in undervalued real estate to come in and generate ultimately a lot of rate of return by buying low and ultimately selling higher. So anyway, that's what I would be doing. So yes, I would be investing in real estate were I a billionaire. That's exactly where I put my money. And of course, I'd also buy the Orioles. But I'm not that, and so I just keep giving these speeches.
All right, second real estate question. Let's about mortgage rates specifically. When will they come down?
Yeah, good question. So as I mentioned, it's been pretty stable. So we had a peak of a bit above 7% on the 30-year fix. More recently, it's been 6.81%. It's been bouncing around. The Federal Reserve is not reducing interest rates anytime soon. So it's going to be in that range, 6.5% to 7%, I would think, for quite some time. I would guess 2024. When the Federal Reserve starts cutting rates, you'll start to see these mortgage rates come down accordingly. And already we see lots of transactional volume even with these high mortgage rates. So you can imagine that at some point this unmet demand is going to be unleashed. So all these millennials who wanted to buy during the pandemic couldn't find a house, mortgage rates took off. That pent-up demand is yet to be satisfied. So there's still lots of unmet demand out there for home ownership opportunities. So I would think that the outlook for home price is still very, very good, which again is one of the reasons that one might want to invest in real estate, but in this case, residential.
Sure. Okay, last question, hopefully on a fun note. How can Edge of Tomorrow be your least favorite Tom Cruise movie?
Look, I didn't say it's my least favorite Tom Cruise movie. That would be Eyes Wide Shut. But I said it was among my least favorite movies, and it's because it's just, if you've seen that movie, it's very repetitive, and so as it turns out. So that's why. But he still looked gorgeous in it, and so maybe that's all that matters. I don't care. He looks fabulous at whatever age. So.
Anirban, thank you so much for joining us. Please join me in thanking Anirban for a great conversation.